Welcome to a deep dive into the dark and twisted minds of some of the world's most dangerous prison inmates. Today we're discussing criminals who have left an indelible mark on history with their heinous acts. We'll explore the lives and crimes of 10 notorious criminals, from cult leaders to serial killers, and even drug lords. By the end you'll have a deeper understanding of what makes these individuals tick, and why they remain some of the most feared inmates in the world. Let's get started. Charles Manson is a name that has become synonymous with cult leadership and manipulation. Born in 1934, Manson's early life was plagued by neglect and abuse, setting the stage for his future criminal activities. By the late 1960s, Manson had formed the infamous Manson family, a cult he controlled with an iron fist. His charisma and persuasive abilities convinced his followers to commit a series of brutal murders on his behalf. The most notorious of these crimes was the Tate LaBianca murders in 1969, where actress Sharon Tate and several others were brutally killed. Manson believed these murders would incite a race war he called Helter Skelter, a term he borrowed from a Beatles song. Manson was sentenced to life in prison, where he continued to exert influence over his followers from behind bars. He died in 2017, but his legacy of terror lives on. Ted Bundy is perhaps one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, known for his charm and good looks, which he used to lure his victims. Born in 1946, Bundy's early life appeared normal, but beneath the surface he was developing a dark and twisted personality. By the 1970s, Bundy had embarked on a killing spree that left at least 30 women dead, though the actual number of victims could be much higher. Bundy's modus operandi involved feigning injury or impersonating authority figures to gain the trust of his victims. Once he had them in his grasp, he would kidnap, assault, and murder them in the most brutal ways imaginable. Bundy was eventually captured and tried for his crimes, but not before escaping custody twice, showcasing his cunning and resourcefulness. Bundy was executed in 1989, but his story continues to captivate and horrify people to this day. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, is one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Born in 1960, Dahmer's early life was marked by isolation and a growing obsession with death. By the time he was in his late teens, these dark interests had escalated into a series of gruesome murders that spanned over a decade. Dahmer's crimes were particularly horrifying due to their nature. He not only killed his victims but also engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. Dahmer lured young men to his apartment, where he would drug, assault, and eventually murder them. It wasn't until a would-be victim escaped and flagged down the police that Dahmer's reign of terror came to an end. Dahmer was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. He was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994, but the horrifying details of his crimes continue to haunt the public imagination. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, terrorized California in the mid-1980s with a series of brutal home invasions and murders. Born in 1960, Ramirez's early life was filled with violence and abuse, which undoubtedly shaped his future as a criminal. By the time he embarked on his killing spree, he had developed a fascination with Satanism, often leaving pentagrams at his crime scenes. Ramirez's methods were particularly brutal. He would break into homes, assault, and murder his victims, showing no mercy regardless of age or gender. Ramirez was eventually captured in 1985, thanks in part to a group of vigilant citizens who recognized him and detained him until the police arrived. Sentenced to death, Ramirez spent the rest of his life on death row, where he continued to maintain his innocence and show no regret for his actions. He died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma in 2013, but his legacy as one of America's most feared criminals lives on. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, led a double life that allowed him to commit some of the most heinous crimes in American history. Born in 1942, Gacy was a respected member of his community, often dressing up as a clown to entertain children at parties and charity events. However, beneath this facade was a man capable of unimaginable evil. Gacy's crimes came to light in the late 1970s when it was discovered that he had lured at least 33 young men and boys to his home, where he would assault and murder them. He buried most of his victims in the crawl space beneath his house, a detail that shocked the nation when it was revealed. Gacy was arrested in 1978 and eventually sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection in 1994. His story serves as a stark reminder that evil can often hide in plain sight, masquerading as the very people we trust. Aileen Wuornos stands out not just because she was a serial killer, but because she defied the typical profile by being a woman. Born in 1956, Wuornos had a troubled upbringing filled with abuse and neglect. By her early 20s, she had turned to prostitution as a means of survival, a profession that would eventually lead her down a dark path. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered 7 men, claiming that they had either assaulted or attempted to assault her while she was working as a prostitute. Wuornos argued that her actions were in self-defense, but the brutality of her crimes suggested otherwise. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and quickly became a media sensation. Despite her claims of self-defense, Wuornos was sentenced to death and executed in 2002. Her story challenges the conventional notions of serial killers and serves as a grim reminder of the impact of a life filled with trauma. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, leader of the Sinaloa cartel, is one of the most notorious drug lords in history. Born in 1957, he rose from humble beginnings to immense power in organized crime. His cartel trafficked massive quantities of drugs, earning billions. Built on violence and corruption, his empire used tunnels to evade law enforcement. Recaptured in 2016, he was extradited to the U.S. and faced numerous charges. In 2019, El Chapo was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His story highlights the far-reaching impact of the global drug trade. Robert Maudsley, often referred to as Hannibal the Cannibal, is one of the most feared inmates in the British prison system. Born in 1953, Maudsley's early life was marred by abuse and neglect, leading him down a path of crime and violence. His first murder occurred in 1974 when he killed a man who had allegedly shown him photographs of children he had abused. Maudsley was initially sent to a psychiatric hospital, but his violent tendencies only escalated. In 1978, he killed 2 inmates in one day, reportedly eating parts of their brains, a detail that earned him the moniker Hannibal the Cannibal. Maudsley's crimes were so shocking that he was placed in solitary confinement, where he remains to this day. His cell is a specially constructed glass enclosure reminiscent of the one depicted in the film Silence of the Lambs. Maudsley's story is a chilling example of how early trauma and mental illness can lead to extreme violence. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is one of the most prolific serial killers in history, with a victim count that may exceed 300. Born in 1948 in Colombia, Lopez's early life was filled with violence and hardship. By his teenage years, he had turned to a life of crime, eventually escalating to the murder of young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Lopez's method was chillingly systematic. He would lure his victims with promises of gifts or money, take them to secluded areas, and then brutally assault and murder them. Lopez was finally captured in 1980, and during his interrogation, he confessed to the murder of hundreds of young girls. Despite his monstrous actions, Lopez served only 14 years in prison in Ecuador before being released for good behavior, a decision that sparked outrage and fear. His story is a stark reminder of the potential for human depravity and the failures of the legal system to adequately deal with such extreme cases. Rodney Alcala, known as the dating game killer, is a chilling example of a serial killer who hid in plain sight. Born in 1943, Alcala's early life was unremarkable, but by the 1970s, he had embarked on a killing spree. He appeared on the dating game in 1978, right in the middle of his spree. Alcala lured women with promises of photography sessions. He would assault and murder them, taking trophies. Captured in 1979, Alcala faced multiple trials, revealing his gruesome activities. Sentenced to death in 2010, his story remains a grim reminder of hidden dangers. As we conclude this journey into the lives of some of the world's most dangerous prison inmates, it's clear that these individuals have left a lasting impact on society. Their stories are not just tales of horror, but also cautionary lessons about the extremes of human behavior and the dark corners of the human mind. Understanding these criminals helps us better grasp the complexities of psychological disorders, the impact of early trauma, and the potential for evil that exists within us all. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the world's most dangerous prison inmates.